Now we have a panel that's emphasizing another investment theme, and I'd like to call Andres Gluski to the stage. He's the president and CEO of AES, and he's a big pusher for what he calls privatization, and I call asset recycling, because he's more of a private business guy than I am, I think. Also, Peter Taylor, who's the managing director of Carlyle Group. Peter has one of those funny accents that might suggest that he has intimate experience with asset recycling. And then Chris Mann, a partner in Sullivan & Cromwell, who's done a tremendous amount of work all over the world in terms of infrastructure assets of almost every infrastructure class. And then I'd like to invite Bridge Littleton to the stage as well. And Bridge is, the way we've done this is we have 3 experts and then we have a project person who illustrates the theme. So Bridge, if you could take a seat as well, that would be great. And let me ask Andres first to speak, because Andres was an original member of Blueprint 2025, and I think he didn't condition his participation on this topic, but he really saw not so much the privatization, but let's say federal assets, $7 trillion in federal assets is a tremendous opportunity that the U.S. wasn't monetizing when we had an infrastructure crisis. So a fantastic theme, and thank you very much for coming, Andres.
Okay, well, when we started talking about this, the thing that had always struck me when looking at the state of U.S. infrastructure was that the so-called Washington Consensus, and IMF, World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and quite frankly the U.S. agencies as well, had been promoting around the world public-private partnerships and outright privatizations for 30 years. And the thing that really struck me was that the Washington Consensus never got to Washington. So we weren't really practicing what we preached. Now, I can't think of any place in the world that it would be easier to do public-private partnerships in the sense of market demand than the U.S. Because what sets the United States apart really is its governance. And that's why people are always so anxious to either fund our deficits or invest in this country if you give them the opportunities. So it really was a question, what sort of a program you could put in place. So I really don't see this as much as a partisan issue. Is what can we do to channel 2 things. It's not just a question of money. It's also a question of the energy and efficiency that the private sector could bring to so much of America's infrastructure. So I don't think it's a panacea, but I really like that people are now focusing on this issue. And I think, to give a very easy example, there is no country that would be a sort of a better test case for what you could do in the US than Canada. So the thing that always amazed me is Canada, which is often thought of as the sort of socialists up north, had done much more about private-public partnerships than the United States. So now we're talking about setting up a non-profit but separate institute for air traffic control, which is something that Canada pioneered. And if you look at their 3P program, basically all large projects have to have have to basically look at, can you do a public-private partnership? So I think this is very exciting. I think it's something that's long due in the US. I think we should look at it as something that should be part of the fabric of how you think about infrastructure in the US, regardless of which party is in power. Again, I think we have to approach it sort of in a scientific fashion. Look at what worked, be very pragmatic about it. It doesn't work for everything. Certainly maintenance on existing infrastructure is very difficult, if not impossible, to do. On the other hand, if you're looking at new investments, or assets which generate their own revenue stream, then these models become much more applicable. So I'd like to finalize on that note, sort of just an opening statement, that I think this is something we should really look at, see how we can use the energy and the drive of the private sector in order to upgrade America's infrastructure. And there are so many positive externalities. We really want to get economic growth going. In the short run, nothing employs, I would say, semi-skilled labor like building infrastructure. And in the longer term, that's what's going to make you more efficient. It's going to improve your exports. It's going to make the economy more competitive.
Very good. And Peter, you're the new kid on the block in terms of you just joined Carlisle from 15 years at Hastings, where you've done projects all over the world, but really understanding the uniqueness and the promise of the Australian asset recycling models. A phenomenal opportunity, I would think, for the U.S. And we discussed that over dinner a bit last night as well.
Yeah, no, we did, and it was we chatted further on it a couple of weeks ago, and I apologise for the strange accent. But we were having a chat, and then over the last almost 20 years now, having been involved in the infrastructure asset class from the principal, from the investor side, and having a lot of friends and colleagues globally across a lot of pensions, sovereign wealth, and insurers, a real strong interest. And we were going back, what was the driving force behind asset recycling? I'm not sure how many of you have ever been to Sydney, but I think Sydney manages to outdo DC with respect to how bad the traffic is, the issues around the commute on the equivalent metro. And back in 2011, Barry O'Farrell, who was the Premier, he said, we've got to restart this, and he's looking at his balance sheet and said, we'll drop an investment, we'll drop a rating grade if we borrow. We're not that great at delivering. But he said, we own all these businesses that have revenue streams, to the point that Andreas said. He said, well, what if we start off with a concept of recycling? We'll exit out of businesses that we currently own, we'll monetize the equity, repay the debt, and then we'll use that equity to build. And he then thought about it further, and he said, when they tried this in Victoria back in the 1990s, it was an austerity measure, and people ran out of the willingness to do it because there was nothing new coming from what they were losing. So Barry got succeeded by Mike Baird, and Mike put this concept forward called Restart New South Wales. And what he really did, and fortunately, unfortunately, I had the chance to lead 3 of the last 7 that have been done in Australia. But it was like, how do we take these commercial businesses, how do we go out and attract capital? And I remember talking to Mike Baird when we did the Transgrid lease and concession lease in late 2015. He said, Pete, this feels like the United Nations. There's you, there's ADIA, there's Renthouse, which was Kuwait, there's CDPQ from Canada, and an Australian permanent capital vehicle. I said, yeah, so it was very much about bringing global capital with local leadership. But Mike, what you've done very well, and I think this is a key theme that we've observed from the equity side over the last 20 years, is how do we enshrine the protections for government and the taxpayer in those contracts? I got asked an interesting question at dinner last night. It's like, well, how do we make you guys deliver the capital for the improvements that you promise? So it's interesting, I've negotiated a number of these concessions, and early on when we did the airports in the late 1990s, there was this thing called Schedule 11, which actually became a real nightmare for ourselves and the airlines because it stipulated what capital improvement. And we changed that within 5 years and said, actually, we've got to be customer-focused infrastructure. What do we need to deliver to meet the requirements of airlines, users? How do we deliver that? How do we agree a price path with government through these agreements? And very much what we've been able to do, and it's a strategy that works, is very much bring that global capital with local leadership, aware of local stakeholder issues. But then what we did for the New South Wales government over time, and the private sector as a whole, is through the 6 recyclings that they did, almost said privatisation, the 6 recyclings that they did, they raised about $25 billion. Joe Hockey, who's the Australian ambassador here at the moment, he was federal treasurer at the time, and he said, look, we'll kick in 15% on top of what you raise. But we're only going to kick that 15% in if you invest in new, expansive infrastructure. So Sydney looked at them, they looked at themselves and they said, we need light rail in Newcastle, so a regional project. We need a lot of investment in regional projects, so they made sure the regions got taken care of. And there are highly important projects in the regions. But in the centre of Sydney, they said, we need to finish the road network we never had, we need to duplicate the harbour crossing, and we need to add more metro capacity, and we need to make sure the maintenance is up to date, the point that Andreas made. So all those projects are going forward. Mike's now retired and Gladys is now Premier. I saw her recently, and those projects are on track to be delivered. And the thing that they're looking for, and New South Wales is now a AAA rating, budget surplus, but what they're looking for is what do we own that we can monetise? How can we use that to build new infrastructure How do we hold the private sector accountable? How do we make sure they deliver? I can tell you, I've sat there and negotiated termination rights, and if we do not deliver to performance standards that are higher than what the state operated, we have the risk of termination. So I think the evolution, I'm not sure we get there straight away, potentially, but one of the ones I thought was most interesting, and just kind of to wrap up, last year they did the recycling of Ausgrid. Ausgrid's about a $15 billion network. It needs about $4 billion of capex over the next 5 years. And basically the private sector worked out what was the value for half of the equity in it, put that equity up, bought that half off the government. They gave them $6 billion. And then funded through equity and debt what was the additional $4 billion, but they got control of the delivery. So how do we drive the efficiencies and the improvements in contracting strategies, risk allocation, through delivering capital and delivering maintenance? So I think it's a fascinating forum. Interesting enough, I first moved to the US 10 years ago when I thought we were on the previous wave. I've spent the subsequent 10 years going around the globe doing this everywhere. But I think it's a really interesting opportunity. I think the way the market looks, I think this is going to be more largely driven by states and municipalities that want to bring opportunities forward in conjunction with the private sector, and then DC helps get that through the process.
That's great, and I just love the call it asset recycling. Why would you call it privatization? That makes people mad. But you're actually doing asset recycling, right? I mean, that's exactly what it is. Chris, your job, of course, is to explain why it's so easy to do that in the U.S. and why it's going to be a lot more quick, or what is the term the president uses, bigly, than you can even imagine.
So hearing what a number of people have said about there is no shovel-ready project, I was thinking of manure when people were talking about shovel-ready. That's basically the only thing you can move quickly with a shovel. But I would also say Peter's accent is not the strange one. If you kick around enough time in the U.S. infrastructure space, you realize everybody who's an investor or an advisor is Australian, because we're so far behind Australia. And there's so much to talk about here, but I know we're focused on asset recycling, but I think although the panel is described as federal asset recycling, and there are obviously a lot of federal assets that could be disposed of, it is certainly the case that in terms of an integrated national program, I think what is going to be important is some use of public-private partnerships at the state municipal level, which, as Congressman Fazo mentioned, could be incentivized by an Australian-style asset recycling program to provide an incentive. Now, whether that's a grant, Australian case, it's a grant of 15% on top of sort of a premium on what they're already getting as use of proceeds from the grant of a long-term concession, or maybe it's just expansion of existing federal programs in the transportation or water sector, which would be loan guarantee programs, so that because everybody knows there's very little interest in Congress and the party in power to spend $1 trillion or even a fraction of that on outlays. So use a little bit in terms of guarantee programs, or maybe a small number of grants to incentivize states and municipalities. But I think we also need to build understanding of what it means. And as you accidentally said, privatization, right? I've heard people on panels talk in very general terms about sale of assets, and I think we need to get the public to understand it's a grant of a long-term concession in most cases, obviously a bunch of different ways to do it, but a grant of a long-term concession, it eventually reverts back to the state or the municipality. You're transferring the risk to a private operator. As everybody knows from who's involved in the first wave of privatizations in this country in the mid-2000s, many of those toll roads went bankrupt. The point is, though, that there was no interruption in service. Those private operators gave up their equity to banks, as have been re-auctioned. Those toll roads in most cases are operating much better than they were in state hands. Obviously, Pennsylvania Turnpike would have been the really big one and didn't get done. Speaking of asset recycling, I think one reason that Penn Turnpike didn't get done is it was not clear where the funds were going to be spent and whether they were going to be spent in a way that would actually benefit the infrastructure as an asset class in Pennsylvania. Other examples in the U.S. have been much better at that. Indiana Toll Road. You can easily look at the list of states and what their use of proceeds would be for the grant of long-term concessions. And it's certainly much more, as a policy matter, much more sensible. If you think about it, you're putting in the hands of a private operator for billions of dollars in proceeds to the state or the municipality. The state or the municipality commits to spend those billions on infrastructure. As Peter was explaining yesterday, a lot of that could just go into a fund and you decide how to spend it later. I personally think one thing that we should be considered doing is actually requiring states and municipalities as a condition to getting that any kind of federal funding to keep some skin in the game. And I think that could be attractive from both a Republican point of view and certainly a Democrat point of view to keep the community and keep the state or the municipality with some interest in the ongoing successful operation of the venture. And that could be kind of quasi-equity or synthetic equity. It could actually be taking a sort of those in private equity in the audience, sort of a promote structure. Because every time you grant City of Chicago grants a 75 or a 99-year concession on Chicago Skyway, takes the money up front, spends it in part, frankly, to fill budget gaps and pension obligations. Every time that asset trades, and it traded last year to our clients in the secondary market, and billions more are paid, the concession grantor feels like it's missing out. So if they got a little bit of money every time, that would be good. Last thing I'll say, and I'll shut up, but you mentioned how to allocate the risks. One interesting thing, as you know now, Peter, in the U.S. market, in terms of both airports and toll roads, is that those concession agreements have been tested pretty well, and many of them you could, and I'm saying this from a lawyer's point of view, you could blackline one concession agreement against the other. Even airports against toll roads, and they've attracted so much foreign capital that we really do have a tried and true basic model. And organizations like the Build America Bureau at DOT are trying to put together model contracts to help that.
Great. So, one of the things is that talking about it's interesting, but if we have a specific project that illustrates some of the themes we're talking about, maybe a project that's good to go, that would be interesting, right? Because that would illustrate the discussion. So, Bridge, could you show us what you have?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it, Norman. I appreciate the panel. So I don't know if the slides are available.
They should be loaded, right? The slides? Yep.
There we go. So really what this project is it's around GPS, the global positioning system that all of us really rely on. And, I don't think a lot of people really realize here, so my goal here today is, number one, sort of educate a little bit on, wow, I had no idea it was this pervasive, and number two of, oh my God, I had no idea how vulnerable we are. But GPS is an integral part of our lives to ways in which we don't even imagine. I mean, every single person here has GPS with you where you sit, if you have a phone or you have your computer with you. What you don't probably realize is what it actually does for you. It doesn't just help you get to McDonald's or get to Starbucks. It does a lot more. If you want to go to the next slide. GPS is actually now, it's the hidden utility. It is like water, it is like power. It provides three critical elements to our daily lives. It's called position, navigation, and timing. Position, navigation are pretty easy, but timing is something that is network synchronization, where globally, any computer or electronic system in the world, essentially, in order for it to function, it has to be synchronized with time. And everybody in the world uses GPS. GPS is absolutely a national treasure. Not only is it a national treasure, it is a huge vulnerability because it is a single point of failure. Every single one of these critical infrastructure sectors that you see represented here is critically dependent upon GPS. So what that means is if GPS is unavailable, even only for a couple hours or a day, these infrastructure sectors fail. When I mean fail, I mean they stop. Broadcast TV fails, the New York Stock Exchange can't do equity trades, ATM machines utilize GPS. So that is how integral it is to our society. If you want to go to the next slide. So GPS is great in many ways, and by no means are we saying we want to do away with GPS. We want to protect it. We want to strengthen it, we want to augment it, because GPS has one critical weakness. It's 12,000 miles in space, and the signal is very weak. That's why it doesn't work very well indoors. And unfortunately, it's easily affected by solar weather, it's easily affected by buildings and reflection and stuff like that, but the worst thing is, it's susceptible to little tiny devices like this, to jamming. Whether it's intentional or unintentional or signal interference, GPS is incredibly easy to jam. This is a $50 Chinese jammer that if I had a cigarette outlet and I plugged it in, I would jam all the GPS in this entire building. The internet would fail, your cell phones would fail, no ATM machine would work. That's how scary this is. There are literally thousands of GPS jamming, intentional and unintentional events in the United States every year, and it's growing by 400% annually. The GPS jammer market by 2025 is going to be a $20 billion industry on its own. So, this is a very serious problem. How can we solve this problem? The solution is incredibly easy. If you want to go to the next slide. Taking an old government technology, repurposing it, modernizing it, putting it on the air as a backup signal for GPS. If you go to the next slide. It's known as eLORAN or Enhanced LORAN. Now, for a lot of you here who've been boating or maybe in the Navy or in the Coast Guard in your past lives, you go, oh, LORAN, I remember that thing. That was at towers, and we navigated the waters with it and all that kind of stuff. That's exactly what it is. It's been around since World War II. And it was in use until 2010, and it was unfortunately decommissioned for a OMB budgetary cost exercise, not for the practicality of why we really use it. But what it is, it's 19 700-foot towers that are positioned across the United States with a signal that has a range of over 1,000 miles and is 1.5 million times stronger than GPS. It can penetrate buildings, it can go underwater, it's virtually jam-proof, it's virtually spoof-proof. It's available today. It's an old legacy technology that if modernized, upgraded, improved with solid-state equipment, could be on air. Literally we could be on air with an initial capability to back up GPS within 90 days. You could have full timing within a year, and you could have full backup for GPS within 2 years. 100% privately funded. Absolutely no federal government dollars would be needed to do this. And we would take these great assets, these national treasures that we have in these LORAN stations, and repurpose them. Put them back on air and provide a capability both to our country and to our commercial sectors. And the last thing I'll say about LORAN is, over the last 35 years, we have spent over $1 billion on LORAN with federal government money. And we're getting ready to basically just throw that away, when there's a capability there that we can repurpose and reuse. And the last thing is, and this is to me the part that is just the no-brainer, these are brownfield sites. These are sites that if we're not going to do something with them, we have to get rid of them. We have to take them down, we have to dismantle them. It would cost the government $189 million to dismantle them. Why do that? To your point, let the private sector take the risk, repurpose it. We don't want to own LORAN, we just want to operate it. Provide it as a subscription for users to pay subscription fees. The government would get a great service for free. And it could be done at literally dollars to the year to the consumer and to the individual users. So it's one of those projects which are, I'm not going to say shovel ready, but are ready to go. No permitting, no regulatory issues, no statutory issues. The government has the full authority it needs to just do it. What's lacking is the decision. That's the only impediment. So this is one of those great projects where we really do take and bring something back and make it modern and make it work for the future.
That's great, and you know, one of the things I really wanted everybody to see about that project is how many other federal assets are there available that could be either sold off or recapitalized or repurposed in the way you're talking about with the incredible explosion of technology we're seeing in every aspect of infrastructure now. So what you should do is actually offer everybody here an opportunity to invest in the project. And no, it's fantastic.
The door's open. I'm accepting checks at the back of the hall.
Peter, quickly, what kind of assets, would you question assets that were recycled in Australia, or what have you seen in the U.S.? Our figure, Andres and I did a back of the envelope maybe 2 years ago, and it was about $7 trillion in assets. I mean, it's a huge number. You've picked out, a nice niche opportunity that's phenomenal, but it's a big opportunity.
Yeah, no, I think one of the interesting ones is if agencies or government does a stock take of what they have. The Australian Treasury did that, and their basic proposition was if it's got a revenue stream, let's provide a construct that gets off and protection for taxpayers. But we've seen that recycling come from regional ports to we needed in Western Victoria to do additional water catchment, surface storage, treatment, distribution. There was a recycling that happened across that. They've obviously largely got out of the electric and gas business, and they will increasingly get out of water. They're largely out of airports. And what's interesting on all that is all of them have a customer interface. And one comment I didn't make, we looked at one recently, we were unfortunately unsuccessful, but they asked us to perform against 50 KPIs. That was fine, we can handle that. We're all clearly measurable, consistent with what we did in our private equity business. The existing government operation only measured 10 and only passed 5. So it was an interesting transition period we had to go through, but they were all manageable. But very much taking, what was a customer outcome. I look at some across the US and this is my host nation, I'm a guest. But when I look at things like combined, I was chatting to Mike Hyman last night, I look at things like combined sewer and stormwater. And that's just an accident of history. Add population growth in a significant downpour, you've basically got raw sewage coming out. I look at that as well, who wants that in their neighbourhood? And that's a real issue in Kansas City and other cities. That's one. I look at, controversial, I'll say it, I look at Penn Turnpike, I look at all the bridge replacement through Pennsylvania and say, why don't they turn around and say, okay, what do we need capital-wise? What would someone bid for 40% of Penn Turnpike? Don't give the money to the state, put the money into the business and get that done. Similar to what they did on Ausgrid. And I think there's, as I wander the globe, and Mike and I Chris and I, have got a number of friends in common, but when I talk to people I've done these with in Canada, Europe, Asia, they're not looking for control, they're just looking for what's that right environment. And what has the experience over the last 20 years is if you do not deliver outcomes to stakeholders, you will not get the profits on it.
Andres?
I think what's very important here is to set what are the objectives. So unfortunately, the word privatization in some quarters has a bad connotation. But mostly I think that was because when a lot of them were done in the 80s and 90s, they were basically austerity measures. And the government measured success or failure according to how much money it raised, rather than how much it improved services. So what I think that, when you talk about like shovel ready, I think there has to be an objective that very clearly stated. It's like improving people's lives. Infrastructure improves people's lives. It creates jobs, yes. It can also, again, improve the quality of services. But if that's the stated objective, you approach it in a different way than if you're trying to raise as much money as possible. And then you can have more KPIs in terms of quality of service and how much you're going to improve. Now, when you get this, again, shovel ready, what we have to realize is there's a lot of things operating, which the government owns, which could be relatively easy to do some sort of basically lease or have the private sector administer. So one of the sectors is, for example, hydroelectricity. You have the Army Corps of Engineers has 10 gigawatts of hydropower in the US, and most of the turbines are about my age. And quite frankly, when in the private sector, we were having privatized the electricity of Cameroon, our turbines were much newer and much more efficient. That does not make sense. And if you talk to the Army Corps of Engineers, they say, we don't really want to do that. That's not our core business. That would be extremely easy, extremely fast to pass the private sector. To be a little controversial, I will even look at the Tennessee Valley Authority. If you look at why it was founded in 1933, it was to electrify Appalachia, also water control systems. Well, that would be very easy to have an administrative contract for. So you don't have to get bogged down in the legal rules of privatization, because then this is selling of state assets, you have different jurisdiction. So what I would ask for is really some creativity here, but really stating what's the goal. We want to have, here in DC, you don't have to go very far. When it rains, our storm drains get mixed with sewage and you're jogging down the C&O Canal and it's not the most pleasant experience. Well, there are so many examples that we don't have to reinvent the wheel on these issues. And perhaps nothing succeeds like success. So taking a few of these examples, which are, to use the term shovel ready, where you can just pass over administration or operations to the private sector, would be successful. Nothing succeeds like success. Let people see that. But to avoid the pitfalls of the past, don't make it about raising revenue. If you do, I think we'll repeat the mistakes of the past where people say the government sold the telephone company for X billions, which then went to spend for current expenditures. That's not a good use of your balance sheet. In my view, it should be focused first and foremost on how's it going to improve people's lives, quality of service, what you can measure, what's sellable, and then also focus the things that only the government can do, certain maintenance jobs, etc., where you don't have revenue streams, like, who's going to control dikes for our security on the water systems? That's the Army Corps of Engineers. That's very hard to privatize. Well, let them have a bigger budget to do that. I think everybody would be a lot happier.
And I think if you pick that up, Andreas, there's a couple of really interesting YouTube videos. If you watch Mike Baird, he went to the 2015 election, and it wasn't about what I'd raise in capital. It was like, I want to put more roads in so you can get home to your family. I want to put more rail in so you can get home to the family. You're going to be able to kick the footy. It was about quality of life outcomes for residents right across New South Wales. And he was expected to get ousted because he took a real pro-growth and he won with an increased margin.
Norman, can I just add to Andres' list? Those are very good examples, even in the context of the dikes. You could actually, the government, one of the key problems and one of the gating question for any privatization or P3 transaction is there's got to be a revenue source, right? But the federal government could create availability payments or service payments, and then that could generate enough interest by the private sector to operate it. But federal airports, actually Sean McGarvey mentioned in his remarks that we convened a group of both corporates, advisors, somebody from Amtrak was there, a U.S. Senator was there, we had members of the House and key members of the administration. And one of the things that we focused on was this asset recycling idea. But one of the investors in the room said, federal government has no business operating airports. Obviously, there are a lot of port authorities around. Pat Foy they're doing a great job at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey of putting some operations in private hands. But one of the ideas, and as everybody probably saw 3 days ago, the FAA just announced, or DOT just announced, that St. Louis has been added to the list of airports that can do a P3 transaction. And I think if you compare, I don't know, pick on LaGuardia, but if you pick on, if you compare LaGuardia and the operation there in its current state, or many other U.S. airports, with the progress that's been made at San Juan Airport in Puerto Rico, which is the first major airport to get privatized, just in 3 to 4 years' time, vast improvement by putting it in private hands, huge amount of revenue, and that was a fundraising effort, right, by Puerto Rico. But putting that asset in private hands, the requirement, subject to exceptions, is in this federal program that For example, in St. Louis, if they grant a long-term concession, they get a certain amount of proceeds up front. It's got to be spent on airport. There are exceptions granted, but you're plowing it back in. Obviously, you could spend it on money that maybe exchanges coming up to the airport or something along those lines. But what the investor made the point is federal government should expand the program for airports, and that because we have a form of concession agreement that's being used, and actually lead the way by example by concessioning, for example, Reagan National, which is already leased on a long-term basis to DOT, but they've in turn leased it further, and it could be subleased on a long-term basis to a private operator, and the federal government could say, here's the way it works, and then coupled with the incentive structure of asset recycling, you could really start to generate a lot of interest around the country in putting airports in private hands.
Right, I think that's blasphemous what you just said. How could you possibly privatize National Airport? No, it's really interesting. The issue for me is, how do you do this quickly? Because this administration doesn't have, it was really interesting last night, right? Sort of, we have plenty of time. No, you don't, right? You sort of get it started this year, or you have real problems and you need some demonstration projects. Any questions? I mean, the people in the audience, everybody in the audience, I think, could probably be up on the stage. Any questions from anyone? I know that Duels should be in here someplace with a question. He's sort of the godfather of this panel, another Australian gentleman. Do you have a question, Duels?
Sure, Norm. There are microphones.
Yeah, it's right behind you. Sorry, was there somebody in the back with a question as well? Okay, you're next.
Hi everyone, Michael Doolan, Ernst & Young, run the infrastructure tax practice, and like Pete Taylor and many that Chris referred to, also hail originally from Australia, but I did arrive in the US in 1989 in time for the San Francisco earthquake. So I saw the devastation that exacted on the Bay Area World Series and on the city of San Francisco when the freeway came down. But the question perhaps for Chris, I think we were on a similar event a few months ago where I think there was an estimate given around airports that the value of airports in government hands in the US is, I think the number mentioned was $300 billion by a banker who operates in the space.
Australian bank.
Yeah, an Australian banker, yes, indeed. It was my old employer, Macquarie. So the question is, you've mentioned the FAA, and we obviously have reauthorization coming up with the FAA. Do you think there is an opportunity to use that moment in time? It's obviously up against the hard deadline to get something done that would enable more airports to be privatized more quickly.
I mean, I'll just, my view is that really is one, because there's a path, because San Juan formed a path, and because St. Louis now has its opportunity, as people who followed it know that currently there's really only one major hub airport that could be privatized. But I really do think the P3 industry, the advisors, the investor class, they're chomping at the bit for these assets. And to the huge success of San Juan in a challenging jurisdiction, if you think about where would it be of those airports eligible for P3 in the US, what would be the most challenging? Everybody probably would have said San Juan in a near bankrupt territory. So with that kind of success, I think if that were pushed to the front, I think it would happen. I know that a lot of people who are here in the room or who are invited or working either as staffers on the Hill or as members of Congress or members of the administration, whether the Council of Economic Advisors or DOT or elsewhere, are very focused on, although everybody's distracted by other recent events, including healthcare and tax reform, which had nothing for infrastructure in it, of course, at least not that fit on a page. But I think they're really focused on what could we do quickly, and as you have said, Norman, you lose the opportunity by next year. So I think this would be the easiest one to get done.
And yeah, question in the back?
This is kind of general. You're all private sector people, but you're all talking about benefits, outcomes, mutual benefits. And what's lost in a lot of these conversations or discussions and media coverage, and something I realized at this event a couple years ago, is we should all be thinking of ourselves as citizens, as stakeholders, as asset managers. We're not. I mean, we don't. It bothers me to no end when you hear or you read press coverage of these discussions and people say, oh, well, putting money into infrastructure adds to the deficit. Well, we don't do capital budgeting at the federal level. And so that's people don't seem to understand investment generate. I mean, so much of our country's success is based on investments made during the Depression, the New Deal, that we're still reaping. And so these issues of capital budgeting, we need to think of ourselves as asset managers. And also, you private sector people being a little bit better, although I think you all on this panel are great, at talking about things in terms of benefits. These are huge things because none of the discussion in Congress is about asset management. And someone on your panel mentioned the word balance sheet. I don't think an elected official could ever think about the assets their particular government entity controls on a balance sheet, or is, it's not true so much for most localities, but definitely the federal government doesn't, and that creates major negative externalities for all this discussion.
Yeah, Andreas, that's good luck with that. No. I'm actually just sort of joking because that's one of our Blueprint 2025 recommendations. How do you make investments without looking forward to measure what you're going to get?
Well, unfortunately, we live in complicated times, but you mentioned the externalities, which are key. One of the major breaks on productivity improvements is traffic. So, for example, if you live in Sao Paulo, one of the reasons Brazilian productivity has lagged is because people spend, on average, more than 2 hours in traffic, and aren't that productive during that period. Wears you down. So I think we really need a sort of a more integrated approach. Now, one thing I was just thinking here is that there's a lot of talk about what's federal and what's state and what's municipal. But quite frankly, you do have a party now in power, which has the executives, has a majority of the states, and has the state legislatures. So if they had a program that was open to everybody, but there was really sort of a party program, we're going to advance this. Nothing succeeds like success. I think a lot could get done. Because if there's going to be a lot of bickering between the states and between the federal, then a lot less will get done. Because who has jurisdiction? But there actually is a very interesting opportunity. Of course, it can't be done on partisan lines, but if there is a will of doing this, there's a tremendous opportunity in the current environment.
Let me, if you all don't mind, we're going to break for a coffee break. You all are going to be around so we can continue the discussion, but I do want to not go beyond 15 minutes behind schedule. And there's also a tremendous technology exhibit. Terry Bennett from Autodesk has a virtual reality system that's phenomenal, but he brought in the whole ecosystem behind that, and then also SPX, Waukesha, and others are focusing on how we create jobs in the country. So this was designed to really be a fire starter, as they call it at the World Economic Forum, and I think we've done a pretty good job of that. So let's give the panel a hand. Thank you very much.